I went to NYU and that was it. I used all of my dad's life insurance. I used every penny of my dad's life insurance to get me through school and get me that damn license so, I can do something I give a shit about. Because for a long time, I didn't have anything to give a shit about. I didn't know, if I was worth even the time to give a shit about something. I felt like a failure.
All right, Danielle. Danielle, where are you from originally?
I am from Long Island. I moved there about 4 or 5 years old. I was born in Florida, but I don't remember really a lot that happened there. And my parents wanted to bring me up to New York to experience more culture and diversity, and they're from New York. So I was happy they made that choice, definitely.
Yeah, New York's fun.
Yeah, really fun.
So tell me about the work you do.
So I've been a psych nurse for about 3 years. I've been a nurse for 4 years. I started out in medical nursing, and I hated it. I felt like I was just putting a Band-Aid on a lot of chronic issues, and I wasn't really seeing any outcomes there, and it left me very unfulfilled. So I took a gamble on a psych nursing job. Didn't know if I would like it. In Manhattan, and I've been doing it ever since. I work primarily with young adults. I love those patients a lot, and it's just completely opened my eyes to the fact that my own personal experiences, my own friends' experiences, my family's experiences, it's so common and not talked about at all.
Mental health.
Yeah, mental health is just not talked about at all. And I've been caring for these patients for a while. I've, care for people that, are in Juilliard to be, professional violinists. And I, take care of people that are coming from homeless shelters, domestic violence situations. So a wide array of individuals. And it's pretty amazing when you see that overlap in the same type of issues that they're having. I wish I could say more to them about how much I relate to some of the things that they're going through.
What do you think the general public doesn't understand about mental health and what you've seen?
Yeah, I think the general public doesn't realize that we're back where we were in the 1960s. I think that JFK had this initiative to break down all these asylums and integrate, community-based care, which is what we're doing now. But that was a half a century ago. And after he passed away, the things that he wanted did not happen because that money was left to the state, and states decided to use that money for things that weren't for mental health. So, the massive amount of, mental health issues, incarceration, homelessness, it's a trickle-down effect. And I think a lot of it has to do with mental health. And I think that we are severely lacking in longer-term care facilities that provide humane care to people who are mentally ill and cannot take care of themselves. People that, are hospitalized 6, 7, 8, 9 times within 6 months, and medication can only do so much. I work in inpatient, and that is what, everyone says is all about medication stabilization. And you can stabilize as much as you want, but once these people come out into the real world, all of those societal factors come back into play, abusive relationships are still there. The drugs are still there. The lack of shelter, the lack of housing is still there. And a lot of homeless people, they come in, and a lot of the times it's because they're traumatized in these shelters. They're abused in these shelters. Their things are stolen from them. They're not set up to succeed. And the community-based care, specifically, that New York has done with, ACT teams, which is assertive care, it can only do so much for such a large issue that we let go for decades. It's there needs to be, a little more an initiative. And I think that it's really defeating sometimes as a nurse, because you know that there are so many systemic barriers that you can just not tackle as one person or even as a hospital, and these people just need so much more help than what is being offered to them. Even the community-based care, they can go to, nurses can go to shelters, and find their patients. But if those patients don't want to adhere to the treatment they got in the hospital and they're still in these traumatizing situations, it's not practical to think that we can tackle this large of an issue with such, little emphasis on the importance of it, especially in this country.
With the patients that come in are coming from where?
They're coming from the tri-state area, the most part, Jersey, all the boroughs in New York.
But they're coming in because of some legal issue or something that...
They're coming in because they're a danger to themselves or others. That can mean legal issues. We have patients that, are having a psychotic break. I've had patients, that have assaulted people on the street, and, they're brought in after that to be stabilized, after they go to the emergency room and, the doctors agree that this person has a mental health issue. But there's also people that, bring themselves in, or, they tell, their school counselor, I hate my life. I want to kill myself. I want to die, and when those people can't verbalize, that they have something to live for, there's a safety issue there. So, these people are coming in because they're a danger to themselves or somebody else. And a lot of the times they do have a legal history. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes we get kids, young adults, kids, 18, 19 years old, they come in for their first break, then they come in a year later and you see the legal history, is coming up, and, they're not sticking with the meds.
Do you see the problem? Clearly, there's often a drug issue, but the mental health issue came first rather than the drugs?
Yeah, I think the mental health issues came before the drugs. I think people were in pain. I think that when you experience things, and I have personal experience with, a substance use history when I was an adolescent, that, I can speak from my own experience. I was in pain. I felt misunderstood. I didn't feel like I had a support system or someone to talk to. And I didn't feel safe. And the only way, that I got relief from that was using substances. And I think the same can be said about, certain behaviors, promiscuity, being, very hypersexual, they call it, just making impulsive decisions, fighting. I think that also coincides with like a substance, it's an addiction to something that brings you relief from what is so deeply painful. And I think the most difficult part about that is people that are suffering and have resorted to drugs, or certain behaviors, they've suppressed it with that there's very little insight, once it becomes excessive.
How long are these people staying at your facility?
The patient that stayed here the longest was 500 days, and that was all because of Social Security reasons and placement. She was intellectually disabled. So those are the ones that we see here, at the hospital, like much longer because it's harder to place them. But the average stay is probably, like 2 weeks, I would say.
So it's like a 5150 hold will lead to
a
stay at your hospital?
Yeah. So, and, that's the issue is like, I don't always agree when these people come in. Like we had somebody a while ago who got admitted because he was passed out drunk in front of a bar. Like what is bringing him into an inpatient hospital in a locked unit? What is that going to do for him in a short-term situation? How is that, like, how are we going to medically stabilize that? That's not something you can do in 2 weeks. And, the person also needs to have the motivation. So, a lot goes into harm reduction too,
And there's a variety of cases, or are they kind of the same thing over and over again?
It's a huge variety. You know, I've seen people, you know, with extensive, you know, abuse histories, and, you know, they get discharged and they come back because a lot of the times they make friends on the unit, and they feel the safest they've ever felt. And, you know, those are, you know, what a lot of people consider like frequent flyers, that they're always coming. And there's a reason for that. It's not as simple as I think, you know, hospital systems make it out to be. You know, then there's legal issues. You know, if someone keeps, you know, committing, you know, these acts of aggression, they come to us, especially if they have that history documented, you know. And yeah, I mean, there are some people who have like very compassionate, caring families that, you know, ask them, you know, we need to go to the hospital, and, you know, they're, you know, amendable to that, but then they get there and they're like, oh my God, this is like jail. I don't want to be here anymore. You know, so it's really hard managing a large variety of patients, you know, when we have people that are like really psychotic, and, you know, hallucinating and yelling and being violent, and they're right next door to, you know, a literature major at NYU who's like 18 years old. It's like a lot of those younger people end up more traumatized, you know, and they say to me, you know, when they leave, like, I don't ever want to come back here. This place wasn't helpful. I just wanted medication, you know.
Is your hospital similar to like what we've seen in movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest?
When I first started, I was
that's the image.
I was kind of like, whoa, holy shit. Like, this place is like really crappy looking. You know what I mean? It's just everything is tan. Like, the whole thing is like one big brown bag. That's what it looks like. And I was like, did I make the wrong choice? Because this place looks really, really like not great. Like, and within a week, I was more or less, you know, adjusted, but I could tell, you know, when parents, you know, and particular patients come in and they, you know, their eyes are almost bulging out of their heads and they're like, whoa, this is just like jail. Or, whoa, you know, this is just like the movies. I've literally heard that from people, and it's hard not to laugh because they're kind of right, you know, like.
The patients aren't in cells.
They're not in cells and they're not locked away, but it's just so depressing. There's no windows. And then when the certain windows that are in the rooms, you know, are covered, you know, triple time so that, you know, the windows don't get broken and someone tries to, you know, jump out. And I think people just have zero idea of what it's like in inpatient psych until it unfortunately happens and directly impacts them.
And they're getting their medication every morning and things like that?
Yeah, and, you know, not all of them are compliant. You know, we have some people who refuse, and that's their right. And I always, always, always will validate that and empower people to, you know, exercise their autonomy, because I care more about the individual as a whole than I do about, you know, throwing a pill at them that they're going to not take anyway. You know, motivation to, you know, adhere to treatment, they call it, but sticking to treatment is what's going to keep you well. You know, and these extra factors that I was talking about, like, you know, homelessness, domestic violence, that really impairs your judgment to be able to, you know, stick to that. So sometimes we have people that are there for almost a month not taking meds until, you know, they are taken to court. And it's a mental health, hygiene, you know, legal services team. And, you know, doctors advocate for patients to be on court-ordered medication, which means, you know, they have an order by a judge that this person must take medication. And that happens when clinical staff can provide documentation that this person is a danger to themselves or others. Yeah, so, you know, sometimes patients need the court order, and then, you know, we have to have the discussion with the patient about, hey, you know, we can give you this pill or we have to give you an injection, you know, and that's your choice. Sometimes they, they understand. They're like, you know what? I'm ordered to take it. I have no fight in this anymore. And sometimes they're not as receptive and they're like, no, I'm not taking the pill. You have to inject me. I don't care. And that's really hard to watch. I think you become kind of numb to it at certain times, but it sticks with you, especially, when you leave, your shift or, even months later, you think about certain people, from all walks of life, whether they're court ordered or not. And you worry about them,
What do you think of the government funding of mental health now?
I think it's bullshit. I think it's total bullshit. I mean, this is kind of a hot take, but I think we kind of need to start over. I feel like we've really had I think it's getting worse. I don't think, Eric Adams had this initiative to fill every single psych bed. So when someone gets discharged, and there's, a couple people waiting in that ER, it's like, all right, we got to fill the beds. And that's how you get, people like that poor guy who was just had too much to drink and, was knocked out, in front of a bar. I think he definitely needed help, but I don't think he should be locked away against his will for that. And that's where like a community resource would be, way more beneficial. Or they have, what's called partial hospitalization programs where you go from like 7 to 3, and then you go home, but you have, that resource during the day. So I think we're actually abusing, the inpatient hospital system. And I think it's leading to a lot more suffering. It's a huge revolving door. Like I said, with frequent flyers, people just coming back, whether it's against their will or not. And I think about these old school, asylums, these like horrible, like the stuff they did was just horrible. They tortured those poor people. But if you look at the bones of the facility, if you look at how large it was, if you look at the fact that it gave people shelter, it gave people 3 meals a day, it gave people medical care, it gave people recreational activities, it gave them, all of these resources. And I think that if we used government funding to pour into, revamping asylums, which sounds absurd in plain language, but if we took that money to invest in a more humane approach to like what an asylum was, and we took a more humane approach where they were ran the same way that, my inpatient hospitals ran, where we, treat people, humanely, I think that we would see a lot less crime. I think we would see a lot more people stick to their medication, because a lot of the times people don't have enough time at the hospital, and it's like push them out and get the next person in. And then you see them come back 2 days later and you're like, I'm not surprised. I didn't feel like this person was ready. And that hurts to watch when you see someone who's not ready, or, you see someone who's not ready leave and then they commit like a crime. Like, I've seen stuff on the news and stuff and I'm like, oh my God, we used to have that guy. Like, whoa. So I think the system is really broken and I feel like we kind of just have to start from the beginning again. I don't think we can pick up where JFK left off with the integrated community care when we've let 50 years go by, plus more than 50 years, without, tackling this issue. It's a larger beast now. I don't know if community-based care is enough at this point, to help people.
Do you see patients that actually, you see your treatment helps them, they improve, and they...
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, working with young adults especially is like very rewarding, because most people have a psychotic break, when they hit, right when your frontal lobe is developing. So like, 18, 19, all the way up to like 25. You could be older than that. But, they have this first break, and if they're motivated to, take the medication, it's like a different person. You could cry, because it's just like you see, how they were when they came in, and then you see them just lit up, motivated to get outside, do the things that they love to do, go back to school, go back to work. There are plenty of patients who make friends there, and they say, the other patients helped me, you guys helped me, and I'm very thankful, and I will never come back. And you don't see those people again, and you're happy about that. So there are people that are very appreciative, and I think that the people that are able to, get the most out of an experience in a place that is kind of ran down and not, like a lot of these patients deserve more. But when they make the most of it, and you can see that they found their way through the ugliness, and that they took a lesson away and feel rewarded with the lessons they've learned and the people they've met, there's no better feeling than that in nursing.
That's wonderful. Do you have particular stories? You don't have to name names or anything, but just do you have stories of patients that?
Yeah, I do. I have a couple stories, but when I first started working here, we also had a program for Orthodox Jewish patients. So there was a lot of like cultural considerations there with Shabbos and letting them use a tefillin, which is a leather long strap, which obviously would not be safe on a psych unit technically, but we still cared for them and let them do that under supervision. And when I first started here, my coworker who was training me was like, well, you have to meet, this one person, like you have to meet her. And I'm like, okay, and when I first met her, she was dressed in all black. Who was she? She was listening to like Pierce the Veil or like some sort of like heavy metal. And she looked at me and she was like, you look goth. Are you goth? And I was like, no, I'm not. I was like, I don't associate with labels. I was playing along. She's like, well, I'm goth, and you wouldn't understand the music I'm into. And I was like, really, do you listen to The Cure? And instantly she lit up, and we had a really good rapport together. And she was what some of us will call chronically institutionalized. So someone who is from a very young age. She was about 19, I think, when we had her. But she was in and out of hospitals since she was about 13. And, her family, disowned her. Her family wanted nothing to do with her because she didn't align with, with the values of Orthodox Judaism. And I just felt horrible for her because she had all these pictures on her wall in her room of like her brother's son and, like all her family that she just hasn't seen in forever. And she never got visitors. She never had family visiting her. And, she had been there for about 6 months. She was awaiting a state hospital placement, which is when, they've tried everything and nothing has worked. Is like state hospitalization is like the last resort, when someone is very often at the hospital and, hurting themselves, which is what she was doing. She was very suicidal and very self-injurious, would bang her head, she would, anything she could find to cut herself. She was anorexic. And you could just see what I was talking about with this trauma and like the behaviors, like it's not always drugs, but this girl, she just could not stop hurting herself. All the medication in the world, all the attention in the world, if there was something that was upsetting her, there was no stopping her. But through those times, we bonded through music, we bonded through, feeling unaccepted by people, because that's something that I've dealt with in my life. And, having those discussions is just as therapeutic for them. And it is for me as well, because, it kind of hits you in the face. Like, wait, like what I'm telling this person, is actually something I should listen to, you know? And then I have another story about a girl. She came here from Colombia, and she was very suicidal, very self-injurious, you know, had a lot of volatile, you know, romantic relationships, and had been hospitalized probably about 3 times in 1 year on my unit. And she was just going through a lot. Like, she didn't have enough money to get by. She was struggling in her job. She was assaulted. And she was just like, Danielle, like, these feelings just won't go away. Like, I feel suicidal. I feel like I want to die. And at one point I didn't know what to say. And I just kind of turned and looked at her, and I was like, you know what? Like, given what you've gone through, that kind of makes sense why you would feel that way. And you would be surprised when you validate, you know, that those feelings of wanting to end your suffering, you'd be surprised how connected people become to you when you give them that space to say, hey, you know, I would be feeling kind of similar if I was in your situation. Because a lot of people think, don't kill yourself. Like, don't end your life. You know, look at, you know, you have your whole life ahead of you. You're 26 years old, you know, which was how old this girl was. And I just think that's bullshit. Like, why am I going to paint, you know, all this positivity for a person who needs someone to be there for them and say, you know what, yeah, like, this does suck, but like, is it forever? We don't know. And that's why we need you to stay alive and try and find something else. And I've noticed when people want to hurt themselves, or they're talking about their suicidality and they tell me about these stories, that me telling them that, you know, it's okay to feel that way given your situation. It's not okay to do it, you know, but it's okay to feel that way for now. It's there, you see a relief that, you know, I don't think people think about, you know, if you have like a friend or a family member who feels the same way, you know. So.
What kind of things are you learning about people and mental health from this job?
Oh, man, I'm learning a lot about it. This is a hard job because you see a lot of negative, and you just, you know, when you just asked me that, I you know, immediately thought of like a bunch of, you know, things that I had spoken about with like systemic barriers and, you know, that stuff. But I think the thing I learned about this job is that, you know, in mental health, a lot of the people in these units are no different than the people that are driving to work every day, you know, and sometimes the only difference is that, you know, there was a 911 call, you know, and that, you know, this person had an ambulance come to their house, you know, because they were acting, you know, aggressive, you know, and then, you know, I'll be driving home from work and, you know, I see these people, you know, driving aggressively with, you know, jeopardizing other people's safety. And I'm like, well, that's someone who just avoided a 911 call, or they would end up in the same position. So I think that a lot of people think, oh, wow, you work in a psych ward. Those people must be really, really, really sick. Not really. I think that a lot of people, you know, like I said, are really traumatized from things that happen in their life, and they just get a little lost along the way. And I think there's a large amount of stigma with people, you know, that end up, you know, in a you know, an inpatient psych facility, that, you know, that they're broken, or they have to, you know, live the rest of their lives with these labels, like, you know, oh, I'm a schizophrenic. You know, I've been hospitalized. You know, it's not that black and white. I, you know a nursing colleague who's schizophrenic, and he's told me that he hears voices, but, you know, he's taking the meds and he knows that they're not his voices from therapy, and pushes those out. And you see the same people come in that say, you know, I'm hearing voices. I don't know what to do, you know? So I don't think there's a huge difference between the people that I take care of and the people that I, you know, see every day, like at the drugstore or whatever. I think we're all really hiding some really painful shit, and the people that end up at the hospital are the ones who express it. But we all have it.
Is it just a case sometimes that the right medication solves the problem?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I think with like very cut and dry, like when the younger they are, the easier it is. So when they're younger and, they're having this first emerging break of, schizophrenia, they're hearing voices, they stick with an antipsychotic, they're good. They don't hear anything and they're good to go. The thing is about, like something like psychosis is the more breaks you have, so the more times you have a psychotic break, the more times you don't stick with the meds, when you fall down that hole again, the harder it is to come out of it. So when you see people who have been hospitalized very frequently, it takes longer for them to stabilize. They're still hearing voices, they still have, these, they're not as stable, as some of the younger ones. And, I was just talking to a patient the other day who asked me, he goes, I'm leaving soon, but I'm hearing a little voice and I just don't know where it's coming from. And I said to him, did something stress you out within the last 2 hours? And he was like, yeah. And he's like, I'm so upset because I haven't heard voices in a week and now I'm hearing them. And I said, well, remember what I told you about stress? Stress puts the body under stress, and that can cause people to have some auditory hallucinations if they have, a history of schizophrenia, or, if you're stressed out and, you're diagnosed with bipolar disorder, you can go into, a lower manic episode than you would without meds. But people still have subtle symptoms that I think derive mostly from stress. If you put substances in there, that's a whole other thing. Yeah.
And other patients that just, there seems to be no hope for, and they're just destined to be in the hospital forever?
Yeah, and those are the ones that suck. Like that, that's, what I was talking about with like what the government is doing, people that are not responding to meds and, sometimes they get discharged, back into the community, and like the narrative is, hey, this is this person's baseline. This is as good as it's going to get, and those are the people I worry about the most because, just because they're stabilized, they're not a danger to anyone else, they're not a danger to themselves, but they're not 100% stable, and they're going back to like a homeless shelter or a, domestic violence shelter, and then they end up back here because, they got in an altercation at the shelter, or, they relapsed. And those are people that I think if we created beautiful long-term facilities, similar to these private hospitals that capitalize off of short stays, I think if we really got involved and the government got involved in funding these beautiful, longer-term care facilities, we would see less people getting hurt in the shelter. We would see less people, in these abusive relationships that they keep coming back to. And would everyone love being at those long-term facilities? Probably not. But they would be safer. They would suffer less. They would be able to have a meal 3 times a day. They wouldn't have to worry about someone stealing their crap or hurting them. I feel bad for those people who are like, this is just their baseline, or this is as good as they're going to get, because they deserve more than that. They don't deserve to just, be shrugged off like that and then sent back into the same shitty dilemma, that was probably causing them the stress to begin with. That probably ended up leading them into the psych ward to begin with, whether they want to be there or not. That's what I think would be like a big help is, restoring our perception on, our perspective on what asylums used to be. And like, let's create these larger long-term care centers that are not anywhere close to what we've seen before, and that actually give a shit about these people. Because if we really care about crime and homelessness and all the crap that people complain about, in the media, in the government, everyone's always complaining, crime, homelessness, all this, whatever. But it's just like, what is the common denominator here? These people are mentally ill. And when the election was coming up last year, I was just waiting for someone to bring up something about mental health. I was just waiting. Most of the candidates, Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that was devastating to me because, Biden, was like, oh, there's a national mental health crisis. We have this whole initiative, we have a problem. And what happened? Absolutely, we got a 988 line, which is great. If, you're suicidal or in a crisis, you can call that number and get some support. But, that's like, it's like a little penny thrown into like this big piggy bank, like it's not enough.
Do you feel like the majority of these patients are basically forgotten by society?
Absolutely. And that's why, I think that's why I stay here and I stay in this profession because even though I don't feel like that anymore and I'm not, I don't feel like that anymore. Like I was, thrown aside for a long time. I growing up in school, I was that kid. Like I felt like I was considered damaged goods by, the faculty there. I, leaned on drugs right away to cope because, I didn't have any support at school. My parents loved me to death. I had a great family, and they didn't understand and they didn't really know anything about mental health. They were very like traditional Italian culture, like you're not depressed or, you're not depressed. What do you have to be depressed about? You have a bedroom and all this stuff. And I was really treated like shit by kids and by, some of the staff. And that made me a shitty person. I retaliated. I was an aggressive child. I was getting in fights and, coping with substances. And I just saw myself spinning down the drain when I was that age. I was just spiraling. And just because I'm not that person anymore doesn't mean I forget for a second that was a point in my life. And a lot of these people that come to the hospital, they go their whole lives without one person caring about them. And for me, if I can make one person feel like they were cared about, even for a minute, that's really all I need. I just want people to know that somebody cares,
What got you into this field? What made you want to do it?
I think what really had me stick with this field and really, really get into it and just fall in love with the purpose of, caring for people with mental health issues were my own mental health issues growing up. I think around 9 or 10 years old, I was not diagnosed with what I should have been diagnosed with. I definitely had ADHD and it was not, addressed at a very young age. And I was very hyper, would not shut up, was just always talking, moving around, and I got in a lot of trouble. Like at 9, I was just put in I lost my recess privileges every day. And I was stuck in there by myself, at 9 thinking, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Why don't I deserve to be out there with the rest of the kids? And I didn't understand it. And I don't think my parents understood either. And that just kept growing. I went to a really waspy school. I'm white. But I went to a very, at the time, the school was very waspy. And I looked a little more different than the rest of them. And, I was an early bloomer. I had the mustache, I had the unibrow, and they never let me forget it, and I was really bullied, and I really put up a fight to make friends, to feel like I belonged. And I had some friends, but I just felt like this ugly monster, I felt like this burden. And as I got older, it just got worse, I started, thinking, oh, maybe I can have a boyfriend, and maybe that person, will make me feel special and I can show people that, that I have something. And, that just kind of threw me into a drug rabbit hole. People are like, weed is a gateway drug. It was, I started smoking weed and somebody handed me a Xanax one day and the rest was history. I was 14 when I took my first Xanax, and there's a joke, people call it the Xandemic. So all these Xanax, Xanax was like blowing up. And, half of it was pressed. It was definitely not like pharmaceutical, or probably wasn't even Xanax. Could have been ketamine, who knows? But I did them every single day, every day after that, all the way up to like 3 to 5 milligrams a day, which is, at 15, like, are you crazy? Like, that's insane. So, I started, using substances very young. It got me through the school day. Anyone who gave me a problem, it was 2 fists up, like, let's go. You have a problem? And yeah, I was this like little, like, feral teenager. And, it got me into situations, I was, assaulted because I was I was drunk, and I was, it was just, people heard about it, and, no one was concerned. People were, bullying me about it, and, spreading rumors about this assault, saying, oh, I heard Danielle's going to be pregnant. Ha ha. And no one once, not even a faculty member. And the school was so small. My graduating class was like 95 kids. Like, the teachers are not stupid. They know, what goes on with these rumors and stuff. And nobody stopped for a second to say, why is she acting like this? And, it just grew into a really ugly, I was in beauty school when I was, I got pushed into alternative school at like 16 because I just kept causing problems. I was fighting with the teachers, not physically, but verbally. And I was, looking to physically fight with the kids that were giving me a problem. So yeah, it just, I was always high until I graduated, and they forced me to graduate a year early. So I graduated at 16, because they were like, you can either double up on your classes or we're expelling you. Like, you're done. And, just all the way till the bitter end, I felt like a lot of the people that I take care of. I felt like a burden to society. I felt like I didn't deserve to live. During that time, I had a friend who committed suicide. He hung himself, and he, God rest his soul, he overdosed on cocaine. He was 15, 16 years old. Like, same thing, felt like completely rejected. And, I think about what he would be like if he was still here today. And somebody, maybe like myself or another nurse, said to him, somebody said to him that, like, hey, you matter. Like, I would want to, end it all the suffering too if I went through what you went through. But, this is not forever, and I don't think he had that. And, I got in a physical altercation that landed me in court at 17, thankfully, not 18. And that was kind of a slap in the face. Like, okay, like, I'm about to be a legal adult. Like, I cannot fuck around and do this shit anymore. Like, and a year after that, or a year or two after that, my dad was diagnosed with lung cancer, and 3 months later, he was gone. And my dad, I'm an only child, so it was just my mom and my dad. So that gutted me, and it made me feel more lost than I ever did. Sorry. And it turned me to a lot of, I had 2 very abusive relationships after that. And it took a lot of work to crawl out of that, and realize that, like, I should be a nurse. My dad passed. I know what the hospital's like. I want to show people that they are cared about, and I need to do this for me, for my dad, for the people that didn't get it. And, I went to NYU, and that was it. I used all of my dad's life insurance. I used every penny of my dad's life insurance to get me through school and get me that damn license so, I can do something I give a shit about. Because for a long time, I didn't have anything to give a shit about. I didn't know, if I was worth even the time to give a shit about something. I felt like a failure. And I just was dragged through the mud, and I think my dad passing in those horrible relationships, that was like the icing on the cake, or the cherry on top, whatever you want to call it. And I still think about that shit every day. Whenever I see a patient go through the same thing, when I read it in their notes, when I hear it, I'm just like, I get it. I want to share with them too, but boundaries are a thing. So, I feel it in here and in here when I'm talking to them, and I'm just like, I totally understand this person.
And helping others is healing for you.
Oh my God. I don't think I'd be able to function without helping somebody, like at least once a day.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Danielle, what would you say is the most important thing you've learned in your life? Not necessarily just your work, but in life. How old are you?
I'm 27.
27.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I've learned in my life, and this might sound a little counterproductive for my profession, but nothing is that serious. You know what I mean? A lot of the times we get frustrated with like the mundane day-to-day shit, like my boss is an asshole, or, my friends or, whatever, and it's not that serious. I think that emotions and traumatic events, like it changes like the weather, and it really matters how you harness that shit. Like you can get, it's inevitable that everyone gets traumatized, by something in their lives, but how are you going to harness that and fuel yourself with that, to be better and to feel better? Because, if we get too stuck and bogged down in that stuff, that's when we resort to, Xanax or, this stuff. And other than that, it's just social support is everything. If you're feeling some type of way, tell somebody. If you don't have anybody, call 988. Try. Even if you think you don't have anybody to talk to, try somebody. Try it. You never know. And just like keep fighting. Like just, you know what I mean? You don't have to put your hands up. You don't have to hit anybody. You don't have to hit yourself. Fight with life. Fight through these lessons to get to the other side. And, because right now it's not that serious.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Danielle, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thanks.
I wish you all the luck in the world. Thank you very much.
When I was designing the first White Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.